Many thanks to Squarespace for sponsoring this week's video. Progression, it's a very interesting thing. If you actually look up the definition in the dictionary, it says something to the effect of progression is the act of gradually moving towards a more advanced state in something. But what's interesting about it is that everybody measures progression in a slightly different manner. So for me personally, I measure progression two ways in my own photography. It's based off of the end result. So are the photos that I'm making today better than the photos that I made then? And the second way has to do with mistakes. So the mistakes that I'm making today, the same mistakes that I made then. And when it comes to landscape photography, I find there to be kind of two buckets or two categories, if you will, of mistakes. You have your in-field and on-location mistakes, and then you have your post-processing and photo editing mistakes. And personally, I find that on-location mistakes are much easier to resolve, mainly because they're very cut and dry. There's not a lot of gray area there. You're either doing these mistakes or you're not doing these things. But when it comes to photo editing and post-processing, that's a very subjective thing. And there is a lot of gray area there. And a lot of times you're making these same mistakes over and over again, and you don't even realize you're doing it until after it's already done. And I think that's what's so difficult about resolving photo editing mistakes, is because it's very difficult to identify sometimes. And that's the topic of this week's video, is to discuss 5 photo editing mistakes that you should avoid in your landscape photography. Now, these are, and I don't want to speak for anybody else, but these are all mistakes that occur for me over and over and over again. And I have found that these are the 5 most difficult mistakes to resolve for in my photo editing process. And I rated these in order of importance, or I guess like negative impactfulness. I guess that's a decent way of saying it. So mistake number 5 is the one that is impacting me the least, and mistake number 1 is hands down the most egregious of them all, and it's also the one that is the most common occurrence in my post-processing workflow. So to jump right into it, mistake number 5 has to do with bright shadows, or overly bright shadows. And it took me a long time to wrap my head around this, because I used to just crank the shadow recovery in Lightroom up to plus 100. I love the fact that I could recover so much shadow detail from the shadows, and I used to kind of take it to extremes. And I still do it to this day, not near to the effect that I used to, or to the amount that I used to, but I still do it. And what took me a while to realize is that shadows, they're meant to be dark. You need shadows. Shadows are a good thing for a photograph. It adds structure to your image. Shadows add 3 dimension to your photograph, and they're meant to be a little bit darker. So I was always trying to just brighten them too much. And here's a great example. This is an image from a few years ago, and this is the final version, which I'm very happy with now. But here is the raw file, and you can notice that there's a lot of shadow area here. And what I used to do is just take the shadow slider and just bring it all the way up to 100, and that was it. And it really just removed all the shadow area in the photograph. It made it look very flat, and it also made it lose a lot of contrast and just almost have that kind of HDR quality to it. And it just didn't look very realistic, and it didn't have any real 3 dimension to it anymore. But what I have found over the years is, one, of course, going to plus 100 is definitely not the right amount. But what I struggle with is trying to determine exactly where that fine line is of too much shadow recovery and not enough shadow recovery. And what I have found is that coming up here and clicking on the shadow clipping indicator, which is this little triangle here, and you'll notice all of this blue area that's now highlighted. And what that means is that this area, these areas right through here, are areas where there is no shadow detail at all. It's basically just pure black, which isn't a good thing either. So what I do is I turn that on, and I just kind of bring the shadows up to a point where the majority of that blue area is resolved. You don't have to make it all go away, but it's good to use as a leading indicator to help you determine exactly where is the adequate amount of shadow recovery to bring this up to. And you can also do that with the black slider as well, by moving that to the plus and negative range as well. But using that clipping indicator has definitely helped me to kind of determine exactly where that appropriate level is. Now, mistake number 4 has to do with distraction removal, or I should say lack of distraction removal. And this is one of those things where this really impacts me a lot of time, because I get lazy. So what I'll do a lot of times is in an image where there's just all those kind of little distraction that don't really serve any purpose to the overall photograph. These are things like little twigs sticking into the frame, or maybe a couple pine cones or little pebbles or rocks or whatever, just small things that just serve as a distraction. They really have no basis on the overall photograph. And I usually like to take the time to remove those things. And this is a good example right here. This is a final fully edited version of this image from Yosemite Falls last summer. And here is the raw file here. And you'll notice that in the water area, there is a ton of distractions. But if you look in the final edited version, those are all removed. And I actually took the time and went in and individually removed every single one of those distractions. And I think it really saved the overall image. Here it is again, this is the final edited version. And then here is the raw file with all the distractions. So by removing all of those, it made a much more focused image. But what happens a lot of times is I just get a little bit lazy, or I don't fully look over the overall photograph. And then I'll start to, once I post a photo on Instagram or Facebook or my website or something like that, and I look at it a month or so later, I start to realize all of these tiny little mistakes that I didn't remove. And it's so easy to remove these things just by using the spot removal tool and just kind of identifying an area you want to remove. And Lightroom usually does a very good job of selecting that area to remove. So it's so simple to do in Lightroom or in Photoshop, really any photo editing software. But a lot of times I get in a rush and I just don't take the time to identify what those distractions are. But it really can take your overall photo edit to the next level and just make for an overall much cleaner image. Now, the third photo editing mistake that I constantly make has to do with just poor cropping. And cropping is something that I always pay a lot of attention to, but there's a lot of things to cropping. It's not just kind of you either crop or you don't. There's things like aspect ratios. You want to make sure that your horizons are straight. You want to make sure that you have good kind of corner management. You want to make sure your corners of your photograph are free of distractions as well. So there's a lot to cropping. It's just not it's not just crop or don't crop. And here's an example. This is an image from Maui. This is the final edited version. But here is the raw file. And you'll notice that it's a completely different crop than what the final version is. But there was a lot of things wrong with this one. I remember that, the horizon's crooked. And I very rarely ever use this auto feature. I don't think it does the best job in Lightroom. But what I'll do is I'll just kind of use it just by kind of manually doing it by toggling the up and down arrow key until the horizon. And I'm looking at this area right through here. I want to try and get that top line matched up with the bottom horizon of that mountain out there, to a point to about right there, I think looks good. And then I also want to usually put my vertical or portrait oriented images in a 4:5 aspect ratio. And then I want to kind of bring this down a little bit because I want to get a lot of these kind of leading lines in here. And I like all this wave action there. And I like how this area right here is kind of pointing down to here, where this mountain is pointing to here as well. And there's this kind of wave break. So I really like the overall composition. And I think this looks a lot better than what this did straight out of camera. But the purpose that I'm bringing this one up is because I took this photograph and it sat on my computer for, I don't know, 6 or 8 months, and I was looking at the uncropped version, and it never really jumped out at me until I started to play around with it a lot. And it's just amazing what the actual crop tool can do to a photograph when you use it appropriately, and when you it's a great way to kind of go back and save some photos that you didn't think were really worth anything at the time. Now, the second biggest mistake that I'm always making has to do with just bad contrast. And this is one that I really, really struggle with. Ever since I've been into photography, contrast is probably one of the most difficult things for me. I am either adding too much contrast or I'm adding not enough contrast. And it's a very difficult thing to see sometimes. It's a little bit like shadow recovery, to where one of the best things to do is to go ahead and make your edit and definitely walk away. And that kind of goes for any type of photo editing, but you just letting your eyes reset. But one thing that's really helped me is to edit 2 different versions of the same photograph. So this is an image from a couple years ago in the North Carolina mountains, and this is the final edited version, and then here is the other version. So I ended up kind of creating 2 final edited versions. This is one, and this is the other one. So I just basically went in and cloned the same image to create 2 kind of virtual copies, and then I just made 2 different contrast adjustments on there. And then once I had that done, I was able to just kind of toggle back and forth just to figure out exactly which one of these I thought looked the best. And this is the one that I ended up going with. think they both look good, but this one is definitely a flatter image. This one definitely lacks contrast, and this one has a little bit more punch to it. So being able to kind of toggle that effect on and off, or switch between two different edits, has really helped me to kind of refine contrast adjustments. Here's another example right here from an image from the Nepali coast. Here is one version, and here is another version. Very slight difference, but this one definitely has a little more contrast than this version does right there. So just creating that virtual copy and being able to toggle that effect on and off was kind of a real lifesaver for me. So whenever I'm struggling with contrast, I will always create a virtual copy, one that has more contrast than the other, and just kind of flip back and forth to determine exactly which one I think works best. So that's kind of something that's helped me over the years. But once again, a lot of times I get a little bit lazy and I don't do that, and I just go with what I think at the time. And a lot of times I find that is the incorrect choice with my photo editing. But hands down, the worst mistake and the most common mistake that I continue to make with a lot of my photographs is just general over editing. This happens to me a lot, and I'm definitely getting better at it. And one thing I guess I can say that I'm getting better at is realizing when I'm over editing and I pull it back. And here's an image right here. This is the final image, which I am very happy with, but I really struggled when I made this photograph for various reasons. I was adding too much contrast. I was adding too little contrast. I had the sky a little bit too bright. I had these areas of the water receding, these leading lines too white. And it was just a very difficult edit for me. But I spent a lot of time on that photograph, and once again, I made a virtual copy. I ended up making two different edits, kind of toggling back and forth to figure out exactly which one I liked a little bit better. But I was basically, at the end of the day, I just over edited this photograph. And here's another example right here. Oh, actually, I'm sorry, here's the raw file of this one if you just want to take a look at it. This is the raw straight out of camera, and this is the final edited version, which I'm happy with. And then here is another image from the Oregon coast. And once again, kind of similar situation. Here is the raw file. There was a lot of dark areas. And with this photograph, I struggled with the overall contrast. I struggled with this wave action in the white areas of the water. I also struggled with the sky. And as I was editing this photograph, I did realize that I was definitely over editing it, and I knew to pull it back. So just being very aware of that. And somebody gave me some advice one time, and it had to do with just the overall editing process. And it's that the overall edit should almost be invisible. It's almost like a good haircut. You might have heard someone say, the best haircuts are the ones that you really don't even notice. You can't even tell if somebody got a haircut. They just look a little bit different. And I kind of think of that same thing with photo editing. A good photo edit, a lot of times you can't even really tell that it is edited, but the most important thing is that the edit doesn't distract from the photograph. The edit should be there to complement the photograph or to enhance it, but definitely not overpower it. And when you look at a photograph, if the very first thing that you see is the edit, then you've probably over edited that photograph. The very first thing you should see is the photograph, and then you should start to notice the complementing factors of the actual edit itself. So before I do wrap up this week's video, I do want to touch upon the sponsor of this week's video, which is Squarespace, who I use for all of my website needs. Squarespace provides a dynamic and dazzling online platform from which to create your website. With Squarespace's traffic overview feature, you can effortlessly track trends in your page visits and views that'll facilitate better optimized content. There's also a convenient email campaign feature that'll help you design emails that stand out and also unify your message across your website and brand emails. It even allows you to schedule posts for the future. That way you don't have to worry about posting them yourself at a specific time. So if you're looking to start a new website, go to squarespace.com/Mark Denney to get a free trial and 10% off your first purchase. So I really do hope you enjoyed this week's video. I hope you were able to pick up some information on some of my mistakes over the years that you can apply to your post-processing workflow moving forward. And as always, if you do have any questions, please leave those in the comments section below, and I guarantee I will get back in touch with you. And if you enjoyed this week's video, if you could give it that thumbs up and subscribe to the channel if you're not subscribed already. And as always, I really do appreciate you watching this week's video, and I'll see you next week. Bye.